This week on the Futurists.
I think the very first policy, and the one I really ran on, was the majority of, I think why my campaign actually did very well, is I had suggested that we reduce the budget for the military and the defense and American defense by 50% and allocate all that money to healthcare and technology and science. So instead of an military industrial complex, let's create a science industrial complex. And that would filter out in so many ways. That would filter out culturally. Everybody would say, okay, we're no longer this, warmongering nation. Now we're a science mongering nation, which is so much better.
Hey, welcome back to the Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek, and I'm with my co-host, Brett King. And what we're interested in is finding out from the people who are thinking about, conceiving, visualizing, and inventing the future. We want to understand exactly what makes them tick, what motivates them to do what they do, and how do they do it. And this week, we've got a superb guest to join us. He is an entrepreneur, a business person who's started and owns many businesses. He's also a transhumanist, a journalist, and a two-time candidate for president of the United States. I'm so thrilled to have you here, Zoltan Istvan. Welcome to the Futurists.
Woohoo! Thank you so much for having me.
Thrilled to have you. Now, you've been all over the place. You just got back to California, right? So tell me about your recent travels.
Well, sure. I was in Germany at the To Be Ahead Futurist Congress, speaking on transhumanism at BMW World, which was amazing because BMW World was an amazing place to speak. And then I actually took my mother back to Hungary, who hadn't been there for 20 years, and she escaped with my father, who passed away in 1968. And literally, they were kind of like freedom fighters, had to leave the communist regime. So here it is, the Russians again causing problems. But it was very interesting to take my mother back to Hungary and Budapest and let her see that. So I had a great time traveling around Europe the last few weeks.
Excellent. And you just finished a degree at Oxford, right?
Well, I'm actually in the middle of the degree at Oxford still.
Okay.
So yes, thankfully, because I love being there. It's like, once you're there, you just want to be a full-time student forever. I'm doing a master's degree in philosophy with a specialty of ethics.
Very cool.
We'll certainly have an opportunity to talk about both of those things.
Yeah, we'll certainly have an opportunity to talk about ethics in tech and ethics in AI and in transhumanism. But before we jump into that, I want to ask you a really straight up question, which is, what is transhumanism? Can you give us your definition of it?
Well, sure. And there are, of course, many definitions, but the Latin would say that this is beyond human. Transhumanism is beyond human. But what I like to think of it is in terms of technology in the body. Transhumanists want to go beyond what is the physical form, what is biology. So we want to integrate ourselves with technologies into ourselves. And so it can be anything like exoskeleton suits that might let you climb Mount Everest, or even something as simple as driverless cars where you use it all the time and it really changes your life. But I like to think of transhumanism as the most radical 10% of the technology that is out there right now. And that way, transhumanism can always kind of evolve. The most radical 10% of the technology is out there right now.
And what you're driving at is that this is technology that would somehow extend or enhance or augment human capability.
Yes, 100%. With the specifics, and you'll hear this from a lot of transhumanists. Many transhumanists would like to overcome biological death as kind of a primary concern, but the much larger field is just adaptation, cyborgism, how do we use technology in our lives, like virtual reality, to kind of become almost a different species, or at least interpret ourselves differently.
So, we talk about technology, but you're also talking about the technology of biology, right? Such things as, obviously, gene therapy is a way for us to improve humanity, but things like transgenics, where we might actually incorporate some characteristics of other species in our genes, as well as the cybernetics you talk about, right?
Yeah, no doubt. And, transhumanism can incorporate genetic editing versus artificial intelligence and everything in between. And there, a huge push is for genetic editing to enhance ourselves. But I would say, if you really ask the 100-year future, it does start eliminating biology entirely as something that's more fragile, more complicated, maybe something that's kind of terminal. It always wants to, cellular nature is terminal. And so most transhumanists would say the far future, out a century or so, is going to be ones and zeros or silicon or graphene and things like that, and not incorporate biology, not probably incorporate carbon, things like that anymore.
So this is what they mean when they say to transport or migrate your consciousness to a non-biological substrate. You're talking about basically transporting my consciousness to a chip like silicon.
Well, that would be the end goal, something a couple hundred years in the future. I don't want to, maybe it's possible here in 30, 40 years. They're already doing some experiments in Silicon Valley with brainwave interfacing and consciousness and telepathy and things like that. So maybe we'll get there a lot faster. But yes, there's no question that we want to move away from biology, which in the end is just something that kind of evolved. And while it's been magnificent for the human race and we've had a great chance to experience the world, whatever, it really doesn't satisfy transhumanists in the sense that we all die after it. And the only thing that really carries on is our progeny. What we want is something where our consciousness, our sense of self, our identity doesn't get extinguished. And that really has a lot better chance of being metal, of being ones and zeros, something that's silicon-based, something that's based on where it has a longevity that's much longer than what we consider the frail world of biology.
It's really interesting, actually, that if you think about like the Fermi paradox, one of the elements of the Fermi paradox is that maybe all intelligences are now AIs in the broader galactic community, because that seems like the best chance you have at permanence of retaining consciousness because of the risk to biology. I think that's an interesting element aside of we're obviously going to come to some fork in the road at some point in the future, whether it's 100 years or 200 years from now, where you will have this decision to make. Does humanity evolve into machine basis, or is there value in keeping the biological entity? And this is certainly clearly still a debate amongst transhumanists as well.
Yeah, no doubt. And let me just say, I think the AI age is coming, but it's going to be far shorter than people realize, maybe 15 or 30 years. And then there's something else. Who knows? It might be the quantum age, might be some kind of other age where things just really evolve into different types of, quantum matter, whatever, and quantum intelligence. But the point is that it's going to go from biology to machine intelligence and then to something else and probably something else after that, but keeps getting smaller, more sophisticated, more complicated, more interesting.
Now, to some of the folks that are listening, this probably sounds a little strange. They're probably saying, well, it sounds a lot like science fiction, which, science fiction is no stranger to the Futurist program. We are happy to indulge in it. But that's not what we're talking about. We're actually talking about something that you can see happening around us today. And you could argue that humanity has strived throughout its existence to transcend the limitations of the human lifespan, of our biological clocks inside of us. That's what civilization is all about, finding ways to organize people together to transcend the basic limitations of life, and finding durable ways to transmit knowledge to the next generation. All we're doing now is using advanced technology to accelerate that process. I mean, maybe that's too simplistic, but how do you respond to that, to say that transhumanism is something happening right now and not in the future?
Well, I mean, considering, where we were 100 years ago, certainly we're in the transhumanist age. I just think, like I said at the start, that if you take my definition of transhumanism being the most radical 10% of the technologies, most of us don't actually have access to that 10% yet. For example, the robotic eye is something that's big on the horizon for everyone because it can kind of take in Facebook. We can do this kind of podcast through it. There's a million different things that ties directly to your neural system, right to your brain. And, there's so many things that could come from a robotic eye. And
you can see in ultraviolet waves.
Yes. And you can see snakes in the dark. You can see, if there's a fire in the house, it might wake up in the middle of the night and say, oh, there's carbon monoxide in the air, whatever. A million reasons that we would want to do it. But even though they're experimenting with it, and some people actually have robotic eyes that the FDA has approved, it's really not available in a sense that we can go out and voluntarily exchange our eye and get a better eye, even though some of those robotic eyes can already see more closer when it concerns like telescopically and whatnot already. But the point is, a lot of this technology is still out there and only available maybe to the medically disabled or things like that. They're actually the disabled often get the transhumanist technologies first, which is wonderful, of course, because we can help that out. But it's not always in our hands. However, if you really look at us driving around cars, flying in jet airplanes, doing podcasts online, we really are in a transhumanist age compared to 100 years ago. They'd probably think this is all witchcraft. 100 years ago.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
I mean, look, at two of us are wearing eyeglasses, right? That's a mechanical way to correct for biological vision. People have cochlear implants. They're now experimenting with all kinds of contact lenses. Some people have pacemakers. Other people have artificial joints. So bit by bit, we are where we can, where it's medically possible, we're starting to replace parts of our biological body.
But maybe
with machines.
Before we look at augmentation of existing humanity, which is obviously, part of this, one of the side effects of transhumanism is going to be the elimination of disabilities, right? I think that's that sort of flows into your conversation there, Zoltan. Even the robotic prosthesis. I'm a big fan of the work of Dr. Hugh Herr and some of the developments going on there, but how do we deal with the fact that in a few years, something like this bionic eye or a robotic prosthesis, like a robotic arm or limb, will be more advanced than our human limbs, and people may make a decision ethically, where does this sit? Where if someone says, all right, I'm going to cut off my arm, it's a perfectly good arm, but I'm going to get a better arm out of a robotic prosthetic.
Well, I think this question is already on the minds of many biohackers. I'm actually a little surprised because I had forecasted about 2 years ago that sometime within the next 48 months, somebody would cut off their arm and put on a robotic arm. And at this point, they're doing it for show. It's kind of a media thing. But there is a very solid possibility within 7 to 10 years, these robotic limbs might be better than what we have now. And people will electively start doing them. And I think when you come to that point, it's going to be sort of like social media. There's a bunch of people out there that say, oh, I don't want to go on Facebook. I don't want to go on Twitter. I don't want to do this. But if you're in a job that requires that, and so many jobs do these days, then you sort of have to. And I feel the same thing is going to happen with robotic limbs. At some point, if you're both in construction, you and your neighbor, and the neighbor can now lift 3 times the weight you can lift, it's got a robotic arms, he's going to be making more money. He's going to be taking care of his family better. He's going to be getting the bigger house. There are social concerns that will probably force us into the cyborg age, capitalistic concerns. I'm not saying they're good. I'm just saying that this is the way technology has been, that those who use it often have an advantage, and therefore they acquire it faster and first.
This is interesting as a policy conversation, but, obviously you ran for president a couple of times. But as you look at governments like, China, the United States, European governments and so forth, which governments are starting to think about this sort of stuff at a policy level, or are we still absent that in the public conversation?
Well, I think for sure the Biden administration has done better in, pushing forth technologies, including climate change technologies and things like that, than the previous administration. But I got to say, when you really look at a place like China, even though there's a huge amount of social control, and there's, maybe it's a dictatorship and these kinds of things, they seem to be very open-minded to transhumanism. And I wonder if a lot of it is cultural. We live in a very Judeo-Christian nation where people are scared of cyborgism. People are scared of these things, robotic eyes. Our privacy is such a sacred, kind of thing. Whereas in China, they're just like, look, this is very functional for the nation as a whole. Embrace this stuff. And so I feel like they may be truly the first transhuman nation, and they're spending a huge amount of money on AI. I got to say, though, just having been in Germany, there were some wonderful things that I saw in Munich, some wonderful new technology. And of course, Japan is always there. So it's a worldwide effort. I just think to begin with, though, America has to really keep on the ball. It can't just be Silicon Valley always carrying the ball. It has to be a government that embraces this and Absolutely. Says, we want to lead the world into the transhumanist age, because as this great democracy, we don't want to fall behind. And we certainly don't want somebody like Russia and China to lead these technologies, because that becomes something very dangerous.
One of the challenges we face as a country in the United States is this belief that somehow America is exceptional, right? We've been telling ourselves that for 200 years. And this faith in American exceptionalism means that it's very hard for us to accept lessons from other countries, because we're supposed to be the first, the best, the biggest, whatever mythology we're telling ourselves as a national narrative. But the problem with that is it blinds us to advances that are happening. So if there's a country that we view as an antagonist or a competitor, these days it's China, then it's hard for us to take in any information about that country that doesn't reinforce that perception of China as the adversary. So it's hard for us to accept that there might be lessons for us there. Certainly there's plenty, as you pointed out, to criticize about China. But what we're missing there is that the Chinese leadership consists in large part of engineers, people who are scientifically literate. And in fact, people who understand how to build systems and maintain systems. Now, I contrast that with the point you've made. You made the observation that most American politicians are lawyers. And most of Congress is dominated by lawyers. And if you wonder why we have such convoluted laws and such a complex regulatory process and such a crazy scheme for immigration and such a crazy convoluted tax system, and it goes on and on and on. You can go through any aspect of where the government touches you. It's super complicated. Why? Because it's written by and for lawyers. It's like the Full Employment Act for attorneys every time they pass a new set of laws in the United States. One of the observations or criticisms of the U.S. is that because we're dominated by lawyers and legalistic minds in policy, we don't focus on end goals or outcomes. Instead, we focus on process, because that's what attorneys are focused on. Did you go through the process? And you end up in a situation where a bureaucratic part of the government can say, like, well, we did the 10 steps in the process, but no one's accountable for the outcomes. Now, you ran for president. You did it twice. That is no small undertaking. Tell me about your motivation. Why did you feel like we needed to change the national level and the leadership? What gap were you trying to fill by running for president?
Sure. And let me just say, in the first presidential campaign, I had a policy that really was trying to restrict the amount of lawyers in office. And it's not that lawyers don't serve a great, something in society. They do their jobs. But if you have 40, 50% in Congress running the show, lawyers are designed to stop things. They're designed to look at all the fine details. And when you're trying to run a nation, you can't always just stop things with fine details. Sometimes you just got to get out in front and run with the ball in the open space. And I feel like we had more doctors, we had more nurses, we had more teachers, we had more contractors, plumbers in office, I bet we'd get a lot more done. And I almost wonder if there should be some kind of law passed, or at least some kind of financial mandate where we support those kinds of careers getting into public office as a way to diversify our government. But, when you run for office, first off, it's takes a huge toll, both on your family and your personal life. And it's a little hard to be on the camera all the time and doing these things. But I think the main reason I ran is because there are no politicians out there talking about the big questions. None of them are addressing genetic editing. None of them are addressing AI. At least they're not addressing it in a very specific way. When you, for example, had the presidential debate, you didn't hear big, giant questions about AI. And, I can tell you—
We barely had a conversation on UBI and things like that.
Right? Yes. And I can tell you, at Oxford, in the philosophy department, the biggest question right now is artificial intelligence. Wow, what are we going to do in 10, 15, 20 years when these things are maybe as smart as us? Who knows what's going to happen? What are the ethics? Should we go forward? And yet this would be something you would think leaders of our country would be, forming committees, doing this, doing that. And instead, it's just too dangerous of a question, because as soon as you talk about it, you lose voters. They kind of look at them. The voters look at it, at it as they would look at me, which was, Zoltan has some interesting ideas, but he shouldn't be elected. Those are weird questions. Let's talk about taxes or immigration. And yet AI is the most important question. And so is genetic editing, these kinds of questions that we can start changing the human body. It's sadly, they don't want to talk about it.
Well, there's so many implications just to AI, the techno unemployment angle, all of that. Rob and I often debate that on this show. But the ethics of gene therapy, in vitro, and then, mass inoculation, just think of the reaction to the COVID vaccine. And now you're suddenly going to be talking about doing gene therapy to eliminate Parkinson's or Alzheimer's from the genome, right? How's that going to play out from a policy perspective? But we are going to have to deal with this at some point in the next few years. We're going to have this debate. So the longer you're talking about it, the broader you can get in terms of consensus building on this, the easier path to policy. So I don't get the whole avoidance of this. I get it from a politics perspective, but it's like cutting off your nose to spite your face. And this is one of the reasons that I think China is going to have significant advantages in the 21st century, because this sort of stuff they see as elements to enable China to outperform the United States economically and intellectually. So
that's a real concern, particularly when it comes to AI, right? When it comes to AI, the nation that gets to a real nationwide scale AI that embodies their cultural values and their way of thinking, In a way, that's a new arms race. Right? They'll achieve a kind of supremacy, and everyone else is going to have to catch up. I know you've written a bit about that. Share with us your views, Zoltan.
Well, no, it is an arms race, and I mean, when you talk about it, and this is why it's so baffling that America doesn't want to confront these things. We have an arms race with genetic editing too. Super soldiers, eliminating disease, eliminating aging, and whoever gets there first is going to not only get the patents, but they're also going to have the economic fallout from it, which is going to be massive. They're going to become, these are trillion-dollar industries, maybe multi-trillion-dollar industries. So it's imperative that America gets there first, that a democratic kind of nation achieves these things, because I worry, especially with AI, the idea that you could send viruses out to other AIs, as they're already doing in cyber security warfare and whatnot. So if you have the upper hand, you can hold the upper hand indefinitely. In fact, this is almost different than the arms race, because the arms race was kind of like 60-40%. You can still destroy each other. But in the AI arms race, it's whoever gets to the top ends up controlling the geopolitical kind of environment entirely. And because it's not, one can't destroy the other. Only the top one can kind of sprout out its viruses, and everything else has to remain subdued. And therefore, you have this, this thing where it's not mutual destruction. It's just simple victory. And of course, if China or Russia gets there, and Putin has said this, he said, whoever gets to the great AI first is going to, be that has the victor with all the spoils. So we really need to watch this. And this is why I wish politicians would take it more seriously. I do understand that military leaders are, and I know they're probably pushing the politicians, but at the same time, I wish politicians would come out openly and say, listen, this is America's game. We better be in it.
It's an irony, isn't it? We're the most technologically advanced society in the world, and we have leaders who are technologically illiterate. And you see that when, for instance, they interview people like Mark Zuckerberg. When Congress calls those people forward and interviews them, it's embarrassing to watch our 70 and 80-year-old senators try to formulate an intelligent question. I mean, it's almost laughable, right? But these are our leaders. These are the people formulating policy. So, Zoltan, what policies would you recommend that the United States enact that we're not currently enacting?
Well, I think the very first policy, and the one I really ran on, was the majority of, I think why my campaign actually did very well, is I had suggested that we reduce the budget for the military and the defense and American defense by 50% and allocate all that money to healthcare and technology and science. So instead of an military industrial complex, let's create a science industrial complex. And that would filter out in so many ways. That would filter out culturally. Everybody would say, okay, we're no longer this, warmongering nation. Now we're a science mongering nation, which is so much better. And I think it's really a matter of budget. 20% of the GDP still remains for defense. And I think, the point of the story is, if you spend that for science, you spend that for healthcare, we could take care of real wars. We have a war against cancer. We have a war against Alzheimer's. We have a war against disease out there that we should be fighting. And we could win if we put the resources there. So that would be my very first policy, is reduce the budget of the military, take the spare money and put it directly into science, which would definitely help America more than I can think of anything else right now.
Well, I can imagine that's going to get a lot of votes.
Yeah. The military industrial complex, right? But Zoltan, it's interesting, that you are studying at Oxford, you're studying ethics, but you're also studying philosophy, because I want to get into that after the break in terms of where this takes us philosophically as well. But in the time that you've been in the transhumanist community, what progress have we made here that you can sort of identify, either societally or in terms of policy, that is starting to see real benefit?
Well, I think for one thing, since I've been around maybe 10 years in sort of the public light, my novel, The Transhumanist Rager, came out, and that sort of pushed me to this publicity, level of publicity. We sort of have been tackling disabilities. They are actually being eliminated to some extent. People are getting better. For example, you had an arm shut off in 2010, the neural systems weren't very functional back then. Now people can get an arm shot off and still start playing the piano with the robotic arm. So you are seeing things like that take place. I think a lot of the technologies are still in their infancy. Genetic editing, we've had a few, like they had the thing in China where they did something with the two daughters and it tried to get rid of HIV. But then the whole world came down with a moratorium and it was kind of like squashed up. I wish we would move forward with some of these ideas, even if there are risks to some individuals, because the broader implications for the public could be massive in terms of saving lives and saving people from death. And so I think in the real world, transhumanism as a community has grown a lot. It's grown as a movement. You hear it all the time, but a lot of the best technologies are still out there. Probably in the next 5 to 15 years with brain interface, with some of the actual advancements that the FDA is going to pass with genetic editing, those things are going to start really changing our lives. I wish I had more positivity to say here, but a lot of it is still, in research and trying to get through the governmental system so that it can be implemented in our lives.
Before we go to break, I want to ask you one last question. So we've had a couple different speakers talking about the future on the show who were concerned about the emotional response to the future. In particular, John Hagel, who's a legend, in terms of his ability to forecast digital change and network change. And he's now focused his entire consulting practice. This is a guy who ran a big chunk of Deloitte and a big chunk of McKinsey. He's changed his entire consulting practice now to focus on emotional responses, fear of the future. Talk about fear of the future, because many of the concepts you're sharing right now, they're going to instill a fear response in some of the folks that are hearing about it.
Well, to be honest, I think a lot of fear comes from your cultural baggage. Or if you're, let's say, a born-again Christian, then you really don't want a chip in anywhere in your body, or especially not in your brain or anything like that. And even if you're somebody who's doesn't have any kind of cultural baggage, you still may be afraid of, cameras all over the place that are taking away your privacy. I feel like one of the big problems in society is not looking at the history. It's really clear when you look at the history. History shows that the world has gotten better. People's lives are longer. There's more prosperity. Less people are dying at birth. People are happier. And it's always because science and technology has made it that way. There are vaccines, there are this, there's that, and people's lives get better. You can see it on any kind of graph, any kind of scale. So you just have to think, no matter how crazy the technology is, that graph and scale is going to continue. Now, believe me, when we introduced anesthesia and all these other things and fire, whatever it was, people freaked out. They thought, oh, this is magic and witchcraft. It's always magic and witchcraft. But the historical scale shows that things are getting better. Our lives are getting better. And that's what we need to base our content and base our feelings on it, that we can trust science and technology after hundreds and hundreds of years of making the human race a better place.
Yeah, this is the story of humanity. We suffer for millions of years. Then we finally figure out a way to kind of incrementally make it a little bit better. And people can resist that. They cling to the past. It's like what we know. They cling, they resist. And then finally the science gets a little bit better and now it can be implemented. And what do you know, lo and behold, it works. And then we immediately take it for granted. And then we complain about it when it doesn't work. I experienced that when I was doing mobile video at first. In 1999, people thought putting a video on a phone was ridiculous. I got kicked out of people's offices because they told me I was out of my mind. By 2001, it was a thing, small. But here it is 20 years later, and now everybody's using video on their mobile phone to communicate, and we totally take it for granted. But in the beginning, it was preposterous. And that movement from preposterous to possible to probable to now we take it for granted and it's fully deployed, I think it's quite an interesting time. It only takes about 20 years for this stuff to grab hold and to really go to mass scale. Hey,
all right,
well,
let's take a quick break. You're listening to The Futurists. I'm Brett King and my co-host Rob Tercek, and we are interviewing Zoltan Istvan. Ran for president twice and he's a transhumanist. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome to Breaking Banks, the #1 global fintech radio show and podcast. I'm Brett King.
And I'm Jason Henricks. Every week since 2013, we explore the personalities, startups, innovators, and industry players driving disruption in financial services.
From incumbents to unicorns, and from cutting-edge technology to the people using it to help create a more innovative, inclusive, and healthy financial future. I'm JP Nichols, and this is Breaking Banks.
Hey there. Welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek with co-host Brett King, and this week we are interviewing Zoltan Istvan. And Zoltan is a futurist, about as hardcore futurist as you can possibly imagine. One of the main concepts that he has developed, he's got a lot of interesting ideas. If you look at his Wikipedia page, you can read about all of them. But one of the ones I want to bring up is about immortality and transcending the limitations of human life. And the acronym here is TEF, and it stands for teleological egocentric functionalism. So Zoltan, tell us a little bit about the TEF.
Sure. Well, TEF is the philosophy that's based in my novel, The Transhumanist Wager. And basically, it's just kind of broken down through the words. Teleological means something that's of design. Egocentric means it's based on the individual. And functionalism means it's rational and reasonable. And so it's almost like a fun version of the scientific method, basically, except for the difference between maybe the scientific method and this is that TEF inherently believes that there is a design in the universe, not one that's done by God, not one that's necessarily done by any kind of spiritual thing, but it's this design that we are improving. No matter how you look at the universe, things are organizing in a way to get us to a place that's more complex than where we came from. And that place, for many transhumanists, the very first stop is to try to overcome death. And the reason we want to overcome death is because we love life. We think life is great. We don't want to, we just don't want to die. And then it's kind of gone forever. We spent our 80 years here. So TEF's first and kind of foremost thing that it advocates for is really that in this design, in this evolution of humanity into whatever kind of transhuman being we're going to become, we're trying to overcome death biologically so that we can continue this journey of whatever we're going to go into.
It's sort of been this pursuit of humanity for the ages, right? Immortality, the elixirs of life, the fountain of youth. This is, if you like, at the core of human existence. It's like the ultimate, you've got the big questions of why are we here, but ultimately the ultimate human existence is where we can remove death. And so there are, as we've debated, there are sort of two paths to that. There's biological immortality, but there is the easier path from a technology perspective may be technological immortality. But where do you lie in terms of the issue where that enhancing or augmenting humanity could potentially create two classes of human? Because either based on the cost of these enhancements or augmentations, or based on, say, religious beliefs or moral or ethical considerations, some people may not want to be enhanced. And you could have like a fork in humanity in terms of our evolution.
Well, let me just say first, I almost think we already are in two classes. The rich, on average, live 25% longer than the poor. And then the things they have access to, good, clean food, clean water, housing, it's already completely, in my opinion, an unfair system, which is why I've been a big supporter of universal basic income. But that's another story. But so I think in the future, though, this might become worse and inequality is growing. So there's really, it's one of the things I've been telling people, as much awesome technology as we create, if half the world gets left behind and we create a dystopia, we're going to look back and say, oh, we blew it. So it's something like humanity has to go all together, and you have to make all these technologies available. And don't get me wrong, I'm not like trying to defeat capitalism or things like that. I'm just saying that there has to be a point when all of us actually improve the lives of everyone, and in order so that we don't end up the species that has destroyed, like all the Hollywood movies are just like that. They always end in with some bad guy ruling the world. That can't be the case in transhumanism. I don't want to think that I spent my entire career defending transhumanism only to have a dystopia occur. So there have to be some kind of government safeguards or economic policies in place that make it so that all of us go, and that even if we are two classes, because I'm not sure that's unavoidable, I would wish we could, at least the second class would have all the basics covered: food, housing, things. They would be very happy. And again, that's why I support a universal basic income. But I am worried as well that we're going to end up in a dystopia and there will be two classes. And that's going to be up to people to look deep inside themselves and make the right choices.
I think that question of economics, you've raised it, so I'll throw it in there. Rob and I talk about this frequently on the show, but at a certain point in terms of human advancement, there's only so much that capitalism and economics can do for us when it comes to these advances that humanity can make, and the advances we'll need to make just in terms of climate mitigation and resilience and food scarcity and all of those sorts of things. They go almost beyond economic considerations, that we may need to sort of think about, what's the purpose of the economy if it's not to look after the basic needs of citizens? Like you could argue that the American economy is the most most successful economy the world's ever seen. But if you look at the basic needs of citizens, then you could argue it's a failure, right? Particularly in respect to healthcare and so forth. So from an economic policy perspective, in 20 or 30 years, how do you see the whole transhumanist movement affecting the way we think about capitalism and economics?
Well, I think at the very core of it is technology improving the world. The more technology we have, the better the world is going to be. And the reason I think that is because it's technology and science that cures the diseases. It's the technology and science that might be able to reverse obesity, which causes people to die early. It's technology and science. I mean, you have friends who are working on splicing their skin with DNA, plant DNA, so that they can go out into the sun and photosynthesize. Maybe there is a cure for the 6,000 kids that are starving to death every day that isn't about growing more food, but actually changing who they are. So I think that the quicker we get to the transhumanist era, the faster we're going to be able to stop suffering worldwide across the world. A lot of it comes from our biology. Now, that's rather grandiose thinking and radical, but in this sense, it's been very conflicting for me because I want to get to the future as quickly as possible. At the same time, in the meantime, I don't want to see all this suffering. And this same thing is happening at Oxford when I just took an entire week of studies on the environment. It's clear that we're screwing up the planet. It's totally clear with climate change. But what's not so clear is how much we should spend on fixing the environment with new radical technologies, geoengineering, bioengineering, all these other things. And that's what is actually one of the big debates right now at Oxford is not, do we reduce our global footprint, but do we actually just put all our money and energy into technological fixes? And I have the same thing with humanity and transhumanism. Do we try to get everyone to the transhumanist age as quickly as possible? Will that mitigate the suffering the least? Or do we try to slow down and actually make it that everyone's lives is better? I don't have the right answer yet. It's just a big debate.
I think if you want to define what a futurist is, I think you've defined it right there, which is we're all in a hurry to get to the future. We're just trying to figure out what's the safest and most ethical way to get there. Go, Rob.
And people are going to take different paths. I mean, there's no way to control it. In fact, I think as I listen to you, Zoltan, I hear you saying that there's a role for government to play. And some of the folks listening to this might sort of react to that because we've been primed to react to any definition of government being active or taking a role in industrial policy, for instance, in a negative way, because we've been indoctrinated for 50 years with this neoliberal concept that, government should be small, enterprise should be free, markets should be free, and so forth. That's been the dominant, if you say, economic theory, but you can actually say it's kind of the dominant philosophy of governing, right? We've turned the whole perspective of government into an economic exercise. It's all cost and benefit, and should we spend here and should we not spend there? Where I don't think prior to the 70s that was how they viewed government. Government was there as a check on the wildness of business. The more radical impulses of business, and business was out of control. I think at this stage right now, with global companies that are so large that their valuations exceed the GDP of most countries on the planet, I think it's safe to say we're back in the Gilded Age, right? We're now in a technological Gilded Age, and these countries are hard to manage. They're almost unregulatable.
Kim Stanley Robinson calls them transnational corporations. I think that's a great way of thinking because they transcend sort of national boundaries and national.
Yeah, I call them globe-spanning information empires, right? They are empires. They're accountable to nobody. The U.S. government is having a very difficult time formulating regulatory policy. It's an open question of whether our Federal Trade Commission can even regulate the companies at this scale. So we're right in the middle of politics, philosophy, and economics, and I want to turn it back to Zoltan to tell me a little bit more about your philosophy of government and your philosophy about free markets. How do you respond to a free marketeer who says, oh, you're just a guy, you're shill for big government, you want to control business?
Well, I think one of the big, and you kind of mentioned this, is one of the most important laws in the books is our view of how we deal with monopolies. I also agree with you that technology companies have simply become too large, unmanageable, and they just can't even be regulated. And I think maybe what we need is, and this wouldn't, the billionaires don't necessarily have to hate this idea, because in the end of the day, it's not whether they have one giant company. It's a question of whether they have maybe 3 or 4 big companies. But I do think the government should step in with stronger anti-monopolistic practices that would keep companies smaller and keep them more nimble, and let a lot of the startups in Silicon Valley actually have a chance to make it, not necessarily be bought out. And this kind of environment, this kind of playing field would be far better for the average consumer, in my opinion, than these giant monopolies that become so big. They're bigger than countries. And you're right, they can't be regulated anymore. And they have often people at the very top of the chain of command, whether it's Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or whatever, that are just, to my opinion, eccentric and not necessarily doing the best for humanity. I want people at the top that could. They're
uninformed about philosophy. They have no knowledge of ethics. They demonstrate no ability to implement ethics in their business or manage that process. And they seem to be amoral in the sense that they're just about, hey, we can do this, and we're not even going to think about the pros and cons or maybe the arguments against.
Government's just going to become AI. It's just going to be a DAO in the future. That's the best way. But that process.
Well, you say that, Brett, but how many people want algorithmic justice? I mean, anyone who's dealt with the legal system knows that is a very complicated and nuanced set of arguments, right? There's no AI that can handle a court case right now.
Yeah, no, I tend to think that the way to do this is when companies become too big, they just need to be stopped. And people need to say, look, you need to break off into other companies with new leadership. And, as an entrepreneur myself, it's like, yes, that sucks, but I'm still going to be able to make all the money that I want to make. It's just not going to be as easy. And yet for the consumer, that might make all the difference, because instead of one Google, you might have 4 different kinds of search engines who are then competing and making the process better. And who knows, maybe with that kind of competition, the companies might become even bigger and better than they had. It's really just a question of, because I got to be honest, like given how I'm a believer at this point that social media might be akin to something like smoking. I bet in 10, 15 years, we're going to wake up and say, wow, this is actually a sort of a disease, and we need to regulate it on a real way, because it's hurting people's lives. I see my mother who's 75 years old, and she's on Facebook, and she believes what she reads. It wasn't designed, and they know that. And maybe you and I and Brett don't think that way, but there are so many millions of Americans that are being terrified. And I feel like somebody needs to step in and say, just like they stepped in with smoking, hey, this is bad for you. It's bad for the country. It's causing division. We're on the brink of, sometimes it seems like a civil war. This can't be good. So therefore it needs to be stopped. And I think in that way, this is where a lot of my sort of libertarian inclinations fall apart, because I say, wow, we need someone to step in and make it so that we don't destroy ourselves just so someone else can make a dollar.
The broader context of sort of the transhumanist movement and these things you're talking about, setting policy, reaching consensus, working out what is good for humanity, what is bad for humanity, the Humanity Plus movement and so forth, there's been some contention around this. So, one of the greatest challenges we've got is just formulating ethics when you have such, just look at the abortion issue in the United States right now, trying to get an agreement on what the ethics of early life is, and birth and women's bodily autonomy and those sort of things. Just the ethics of that is a massive minefield. How do we create an ethical, how do we get consensus on ethics when it comes to things like human augmentation, neural chips, all of those sort of things?
Well, I think to begin with, you really need to take it more seriously. And that's a tough call, because how do you get someone to take it more seriously? But if you had somebody, a president really cared about this, they might say, go on national television, say, you know what, country's coming to a challenging time. We're seeing China do these crazy things, and ourselves as well. Let's form a committee, or let's form some kind of exploration of this stuff. Maybe an organization like NASA, except specifically that targets ethics simply. I mean, this is, I'm part of the Uhiro Center of Practical Ethics at Oxford. And that's what, Julian Savulescu did when he founded that institute. He's like, wow, the world needs more ethics. And so hopefully we will come to a time when we have a lot more people dealing and asking these questions. But right now, everything's being so politicized that I kind of feel like a lot of the ethics is getting drowned out. And the field of ethics is just not keeping up with Moore's law, which is kind of the fundamental problem, is technology and science grow far quicker than we can even think about it. We can't do enough podcasts to talk about these issues, because in Silicon Valley, the next generation of chip is already being born, and it changes the dynamics of the conversation we're having today. And that I don't have an answer for. I just know we need more ethicists.
Damn straight.
So let's talk about the singularity, because where all this leads to, this arms race, this competition, this ever increasing pace of innovation, this all points to some form of superintelligence. Tell me a little bit about your view on the singularity.
Well, sure. The transhumanist view is that the singularity is this time when artificial intelligence becomes so sophisticated that, first off, our understanding of it is no longer possible. It's just way beyond our human understanding. And someone, I think David Kelly of Wired, had said, the next 5 minutes will be more complicated of history, the next 5 minutes, than the entire historical time before that. So we're talking about massive change in the singularity that is way beyond our 3 pounds of meat that we carry on our shoulders. And for this reason, it's kind of a quasi spiritual concept in the transhumanist community. We speak about it like, who knows what's going to happen? Will there be things like technological resurrection, where you're able to maybe either go back in time or reconfigure or reverse engineer atomic matter and print out dead people that once were alive just as they once were? I mean, crazy, weird concepts in our transhumanist community. But the point is, it's really a fun thing to think about. And if Ray Kurzweil's right, and he probably is, at some point in the next 50 years, we will come to a point when these machines become so sophisticated, artificial intelligence, that they keep growing and they simply leave us behind. And if we're not merged with them, and this is the key about the singularity, if you want to take place in singularity, you're going to have to upload or at least have a cyborg mind that can keep up with it, because if you can't, then you're going to miss it completely, and it could be happening in the blink of an eye.
I like Ian Banks's approach to this in the culture novels. I think that melding of technology and biology and the culture series is what I would like to envisage as the sort of perfect balance between those two worlds. And also, you had those technologically advanced humans, the augmented humans that saw their responsibility of taking care of these other human cultures that were sort of more natural humans as well. But let's get a bit more sci-fi here, Zoltan. We've got a few minutes left in the podcast.
That wasn't sci-fi enough.
It's all been sci-fi this one. This is great. This is a great episode. Looking out 30 to 50 years, obviously the ability to download consciousness into a digital construct, to use a digital avatar of ourselves, whether in the metaverse or the meatverse, as others call it, and so forth, all of that. But what technologies or what advancements that humanity is set to make most excite you about the future? What do you think, in terms of what individual things or collectively could really change the way we view the human species and sort of our purpose as a species?
Sure. Well, let me just say, for your listeners, that there was a documentary that came out on one of my presidential campaigns called Immortality or Bust. And it juxtaposed this when I was driving a coffin across the country with my father dying at the same time. Here I was trying to spread life extension. My father was dying, and my father died from his 5th heart attack. And so what really, I think, attracts me is, even though I speak a lot of AI and technology, is really when we get the 3D bioprinting and stem cell technologies and the ability to recreate ourselves. Had my father been able to kind of had his own heart printed out, or even an artificial heart, he might still be here alive today. And since a quarter of us are going to die from heart disease, this is massive. But it's not just heart disease. It's most people die from organ failure. So definitely I'm believing in the next 15 to 25 years, there will routinely be bioprinted organs that we put in our bodies that allow us to live a lot longer. And that's going to be wonderful. But in the greater scheme of things, we're going to have to get away from biology and into something that incorporates ones and zeros, silicone, and probably graphene. Graphene's a lot better than silicone. And so that will be probably the new material of the future, unless we come up with another one. And I think we're going to either upload ourselves and continue to have biological selves here, or maybe the uploaded selves will help us. And maybe it's not a perfect upload. Maybe it's some kind of compilation of ourselves. But the point is, I'd say within 50 years, I would be very surprised if we don't have little angels on our shoulders that are almost our identical personalities, maybe making really good decisions for us. They might be in our head. They may be just through a chip implant. They may be watching us all over because we have cameras or scanners and things like this. But don't be surprised if there's a lot of Roberts and a lot of Bretts and a lot of Zoltans walking around helping us do the kinds of things that we're doing, including maybe attending meetings and putting on podcasts. So I see one thing people don't talk about is they think, I don't want to have more than one me out there. But I actually think it's going to be very useful from a work perspective is from a philosophical perspective, to have many of us out there, even if they're just digital copies that are imperfect. And so I see in a 50-year future, given AI, given brain implants, given uploading possibilities, that there will be a lot more humans. It just won't be physical form. It'll be much more digital. And those digitals will have lives of their own, sort of like family members that bring back maybe goods, commerce, ideas, art, things like that. And so in the future, I see a lot more population, just not necessarily of ourselves, our own, mini me's, I guess. But it's going to be radical in that sense. And I think it's something that a lot of people don't think about. They don't realize that if they had a chance to upload themselves, they wouldn't just upload one version of themselves. For survival reasons, they might upload 100. And that's really going to change the dynamics, almost like traffic in Los Angeles, something like that. Think of it in terms of, wow, the crowds.
Let's build on that and expand it, because of course what we're leaving out of this equation right now, you're talking about people replicating themselves, perhaps in silicon, perhaps in graphene or some other substrate. Cool concept. But let's not forget, we're already hyper-networked. We've been hyper-networked now for 20 years. That's a baked-in expectation that people have. And those digital selves will be living on the network, and they'll be hyper-networked. And so we arrive at the possibility of a networked mind. And if you want to look for one event that would really rapidly set apart the people who are hyper-networked and have backed up their brains to the computer or to the cloud, separate them from the people who don't want that kind of technological enhancements, the networked mind is going to do it, because suddenly you have access to an ever-growing and ever-increasing number of minds. And you'd have thereby kind of a force multiplier on what a human mind's capable of. And no doubt there would also be an artificial intelligence augmentation as well. And so you'll have like superhumans who are hyper-networked, have multiple selves. That's a scary idea, I think, for some people, but for other people, it's exhilarating, right? Like you want to get there, and you'd be faced with that choice. You can imagine, you would go to like the brain backup clinic and they'd say, okay, would you like to network your mind or not? Check the box. And you're like, why not? Right? Like you could choose not to if you want to keep your stuff personal, but why not get superpowers? Why not connect with all the minds?
It's like longevity treatments. It's the same thing as the longevity treatments, that question, should I get it, on my next visit to the doctor or not? It's like, why wouldn't you get a longevity treatment if it improves your long-term health, the bioprinting stuff, all of that? I think, that's eventually where you run to.
Yeah, I mean, I would.
Then you have the scenario of the rich Methuselahs, though, these like ancient geriatrics walking around who've been backed up and have all the power and money, and and I don't know, that's a kind of weird idea, the world populated with these 100-year-olds or 200-year-old people, but it's possible.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I would personally do it. I just don't know if I would want to stay there indefinitely. I'm much more like about connecting with one other person. I would love to, like the future of love could be so amazing, because you might actually be in someone's mind, and maybe you can then exit when you want. But I'm thinking in terms of soulmate kind of connections. That could be incredible what technology could actually do. And I think for religious people, it could be great. You might actually be able to commune in real time with, with your God or something like that. There's so many different things. And the same thing with, if you were, doing a PhD in archaeology, you might be able to immerse your brain in all the archaeological inventions or ideas that have ever been done and be an expert on it in a very short time, and then really be the best in your field. I mean, so the future of these things is amazing, but the privacy issues are so wild and scary that I think that's really what's going to keep a lot of people from saying, a lot of the ethicists up at night trying to figure out, well, what do we do about that?
Yeah.
So I know we're running out of time, but I just got a couple of questions. I want to wrap up with obviously what we can do to help the transhumanist movement and raise awareness. But where does this fit into the whole multiplanetary species thing? Obviously, we could. Our digital selves or our technologically enhanced selves may be better adapted at living outside of the planet.
Well, I think most transhumanists want to get off planet. I certainly do. I think that's one of the great things about it. But I think, in real time, what I would like to do is, I don't know if you know my history, but I sailed for 7 years, mostly around the world. I was alone on the boat a lot. And it was just amazing going country to country, reading books. I dream of a day when I can go from planet to planet in my own little spaceship. So that could be a possibility through transhumanist technology. And all of us then have this new world of exploration. The human race is expanding off planet. That's perfect. But I think, whether it's a digital self or not, I don't know if I'd feel very happy that my digital self is out there enjoying all this stuff and not me. And that creates the conundrum as well, because you're like, then the digital self really isn't me. It's almost like my brother. But, it's better than nothing, I suppose.
But that's really realistic. I mean, if we're talking about if we can put a realistic quotient on this discussion, look, all space exploration that's happening right now is being done by robotic systems. We have a space station, but they're not really in outer space. They're in low orbit, so they're not really doing space exploration. The United States and other countries have given up on that. And that's because of the life support systems for biological bodies. That's what most of the payload is when you launch a rocket into space. So it seems quite feasible or plausible, I guess, to say that, well, if you can back yourself up onto silicon and you can send that personality out, that's the way humans are going to get to other galaxies.
Mars is solely inhabited by robots and teleoperated machines now.
Yeah.
So
that's right.
No, and that would
representatives of human consciousness.
And I totally support that. I just would be sad that it's my digital version or robotic version and not me. But maybe they'll be able to figure it out, or maybe by then you could commune directly with that entity out there and you're thinking the same thoughts as one and the same. So who knows how it'll end up, but I think either way it's going to be very interesting, and it's good times.
It kind of brings us back to the point Brett was making at the beginning of the show, which is if there is alien life, it's probably an AI. It's probably an AI and it's a machine rather than a biological system. Wow. Okay. Hey, great fun talking to you, Zoltan. Thanks for joining us.
So Zoltan, how do people find out more about you and the transhumanist movement in general?
Well, with the transhumanist movement, I think it's just best to Google it. There's news that comes out every day, but there's a ton of Facebook groups, maybe 100 on Facebook. So they're all transhumanism with some big groups. And with my work, you can just Google Zoltan Istvan or my website, zoltanistvan.com, or I'm on all social media and I try to post every day something about transhumanism. So I'm there. You can find it. And of course, if your listeners want, just try to, Amazon Prime picked up this documentary, Immortality or Bust, about one of my presidential campaigns, driving a giant coffin across the country. It's a lot of fun. It's very sad because my father dies, but it really gives a good introduction because we travel across the country meeting all the transhumanists. And that's really what the movie was about. So that was a lot of fun if you want to ever watch on Amazon Prime.
Super. Zoltan Istvan, thank you for joining the Futurists this week. We've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.